sum up quickly what we've done so far. We have the law of diminishing marginal utility. In fact, if you increase, the greater your supply that you have of any product, the lower the value of each unit. From that we solve the value paradox. Why there seems to be a difference between use value and exchange value. There really isn't. And we've got the concept of elasticity. Well, we've got the falling demand curve, like so. We've got the concept of elasticity of the demand curve and what it means. So that if the demand curve is very inelastic, it means that total revenue will decline as the price goes down and go up as the price goes up. If you have a flattish or more elastic demand curve, that means as the price goes down, the total revenue goes up, and vice versa. Total revenue will fall when the price goes up. So that's the basic concept. What happens to total revenue when price changes? Okay, that's really summing up what we've done so far. We now go from that to the key point of microeconomics, namely how a price is determined. Why is a price what it is? Why is the price of oil whatever it is? Why is the price of Wonder Bread whatever it is? Why is the wage rate, as we'll see later on, what it is? All prices on the market. And since there are millions of exchanges, and each exchange has different terms of exchange, each exchange has a price in terms of money. 2 cents a nail, 50 cents for a Dove bar, $180 for a TV set, whatever it happens to be, these are prices. And so now we got to the question of what determines prices. In contrast, people don't know any economics. It's not chaotic. It's not arbitrary. It's not chaotic. There are definite reasons, factors that determine prices. And basically you've got two things. Here's price on the y-axis. So any particular good or service. Quantity on the x-axis. You have your falling demand curve, which we've already talked about, which all we know about is it's falling, it might be inelastic, it might be elastic. And then we have supply of the good. In other words, how much is there? Forget about the textbook of the rising supply curve. The supply is vertical. In other words, at any given time, at any given moment, in any given freeze frame, you've got a certain amount of stuff there. Why it's there, we got into later. What determines why let's say there's 100,000 loaves of Wonder Bread right now in New York. I don't know how many there are, but let's say 100,000 loaves waiting to be sold. Well, in that case, we don't know how many there'll be next week or next year. We'll talk about that later. But right now, at this moment, waiting to be sold, there's a supply of 100,000 loaves. So this is a vertical supply line, in this case 100,000. Of course, this quantity is it increases as you go to the right. Okay, this is 0, and it keeps increasing as you go this way. So now we have a vertical supply line. We've got a demand curve which is falling, and we have an intersection point. And what I'm going to prove now, I'm going to make this statement. I haven't proved it. I'm just making a flat statement. What I'm going to prove now is the single most important thing in the course, namely that the price of anything, the price of any good or service, at any day, any time, will tend to be the intersection point of the demand curve and the supply line. If it isn't at that point, it will tend rapidly toward it. Okay, so this is what I'm going to demonstrate. All right, supposing this is anything. It's Wonder Bread, it's fish, it's hi-fi sets, it's nails, it doesn't make any difference. Let's say at any given day we start the day at this point. Let's say the price is, it's Wonder Bread, let's say it's $1.50 a loaf. It starts at $1.50 a loaf. I'll add $1.50 a loaf. This much will be bought. That's what we already determined that. The demand curve tells you, excuse me, how much the consumers will purchase or the buyers will purchase at any given price. If at this point, let's say they purchase 70,000. Well, they've produced 100,000. There's 100,000 loaves ready to be sold. They're only selling 70,000. In other words, what you've got is a gap between the supply ready to be sold and the amount purchased, the demand. This is an unsold surplus. In other words, at this price, the supply is greater than demand. The amount of goods available to be sold is greater than the amount purchased. There's anything businessmen don't like. Businessmen are motivated here by two very simple motivations, actually one, to make as much money as they can and to avoid losing any money. In other words, to maximize their profits and to avoid losses or minimize losses. They're losing money by not selling this thing. They bought the bread. The retail stores have bought the bread. They ain't selling it. And they find out they only sell it. How do you sell an unsold surplus? Well, they try it. They lower the price a little bit. And by God, if they lower the price, they find they're selling more Wonder Bread. Or whatever else it is. Gear shifts or apples or whatever. As they keep selling it then, they find out the unsold surplus is gone. And so they keep lowering the price until they get to this point here, the intersection point. And as they do that, they sell the unsold surplus. They finally wind up here where supply and demand are equal. The only point at which the quantity supplied, if you're supplying 100,000, this is exactly how much consumers are willing to buy, 100,000. In other words, you eliminate the unsold surplus, a terrible headache for any businessman, by lowering the price until you get to this point. So you have a built-in mechanism, so to speak, in the market, free market, a built-in mechanism driving the price down to the intersection point. Because the higher the price is, the greater the unsold surplus. And as I say, as you keep lowering the price, you find out by trial and error, trying it very quickly, as you lower the price, you sell more until finally the unsold surplus is eliminated. On the other hand, supposing you start off the day with a price that's below the equilibrium price. Let's say this is $1. Say you start at 75 cents. Okay, it's supposed to be horizontal line here. At 75 cents, you can sell the whole 100,000. There's something else happening here. People are willing to buy now because you have a falling demand curve. They're willing to buy 120,000 loaves. They're trying to buy 120,000 loaves. They can only find 100,000. In other words, you have a situation of demand being greater than supply, what's also called excess demand. You have people trying to find the stuff and it ain't there. In other words, you have a phenomenon of empty shelves. Where's my Wonder Bread? Gee, we sold out at 11 o'clock this morning. Okay, so what happens then is the so-called shortage. So what you have then is a shortage. In other words, all of a sudden, my God, we've sold out. The businessmen realize, my God, if we can sell out at a cheap price, let's raise the price. Why are we losing money on this thing? We're foregoing a lot of money. And they find out as they raise the price, the shortage is getting progressively eliminated. And so finally you get to the intersection point where there ain't no more shortage. The shortage disappears and they make a lot more money that way, obviously. Much better for a businessman to sell 100,000 loaves at $1 than to sell 100,000 at 75 cents. So, what you have then in the market, every place in the market, the entire market economy, the reason why it works, I mentioned, I think, before, last week, it always works. Always works meaning there's never any shortage and there's never any surplus. In other words, there's never any unsold surplus for any length of time. Disappears very quickly. Never any shortage because it disappears quickly. The reason is the prices are flexible, and the motivation to arrive at this intersection point is trying to increase your profits and trying to avoid losses. And by doing that, the free market economy is such, which it always wipes out, and very quickly wipes out all shortages and all surpluses. So that you always wind up at this equilibrium point. It's called an equilibrium point. The intersection point, the intersection price, it's called equilibrium price. The reason it's called equilibrium, once again an analogy with physics, physical sciences, something is an equilibrium when it tends to stay there, and if displaced from that point, will return to it quickly. Okay, so that's exactly what happens here. In this case, it's a pretty good analogy. I'm not a fan of physical analogies in economics, but in this case, it's a pretty good one. Namely, that it tends to remain there, and if it's displaced from it, it goes back. And it goes back very quickly. On a day-to-day basis. So, driven by a profit motive and with a flexible free price, if the price is free to change, if there's no legal reason not to change, there's no law against it, we'll get to that pretty soon, then the market economy is such that prices always equate supply and demand. In other words, they make supply and demand equal. This is also called clearing the market. In other words, clears the market of any excess supply or unsold surplus and of any excess demand or shortages. And already you see why it is, say in a market economy, you never have any surplus or shortage. In a so-called planned economy, in socialist economies or semi-socialist economies, one of the important features of them is constant problems of shortages and surpluses. I remember, and this is not because it's particularly important, but it just sticks in my mind. I remember Newsweek had mentioned that many years ago. All of a sudden in Russia they had a toothbrush shortage. Why a toothbrush shortage? Well, the bristles were in Omsk and the handles were in Tomsk, and somehow they never meshed the two things. They forgot or whatever it is, overlooked it. They couldn't bring the bristles and the handles together. It took weeks or months to do it. So this is just typical, constant series in so-called planned economies of unexplained shortages. How come there's no Hershey bars today? Oh, who knows? Whatever. Okay, so this is, and as we'll see later, in countries which have a lot of price control, maximum price control, which we'll get to a little later, there's always shortages too. And if you're in a price control type country, it's wise if you find anything you like on the shelf to buy as much as you can of it and hoard it, because you ain't going to see it very often. A friend of mine used to teach in Vancouver, British Columbia, when they had severe price controls. He's a great fan of Hershey chocolate syrup, which of course is very bad for you. That's another point. So anytime you'd see Hershey chocolate syrup on the shelves in Vancouver, you'd buy 20 cans. If you go to visit them, you open his cupboard and there's 50 cans of Hershey chocolate syrup and almost nothing else. At any rate, we'll get to that a little later. Yeah.
So when the prices are controlled, this kind of demand curve doesn't really exist.
The demand curve exists. It's just that you can't. The mechanism isn't there to clear the market. It just stays at the controlled price. Yeah. I'll get to that a little bit later. Right now I want to point out what happens in the free market. I'll get back to that at length. They're stuck either below or above free market price. Exactly. Then you have black markets and all sorts of other phenomena take place. Sure. Yeah. Anyway, this is just a teaser for later on. A little bit later. Right now I just want to show what happens with the free market before we get into government intervention. So what you see is that everybody is collaborating here to try to get at the equilibrium price. And because this is the benefit of everybody, especially the entrepreneurs here, to try to eliminate shortages or surpluses. And so this is a built-in mechanism to get here and to stay there. Get here once you're displaced and get back to it. Okay, so now we have the important truth, the greatest single, yeah.
How do you reach, or how does the company reach the point of equilibrium? How do they know where the point is?
They know there's no unsold surplus. In other words,
in the beginning, they want to try products.
Yeah. Oh, the beginning?
Yeah.
Well, you find out it's trial and error. In other words, you set a price. You don't know what's going to happen. If you find out, let's say a new whatever it is, thingamabob is producing. You set the price as $8. You find out nobody buys it. You go back. You lower the price. If you finally get to the point where people only buy at a price below cost, then you're out of business. But aside, in other words, you're making minimal losses, and that's it. If, on the other hand, you find a lot of people buy for $5, then you're happy to get it at $5. If you sort of test it, you find out, geez, the shelves are running out. All of a sudden they disappear at $5, and you raise it to $6. I mean, there's no magic formula here. So, the thing to keep emphasizing is it's not like in the textbooks where you're given the demand curve. Nobody knows what the demand curve is. They're trying to find out, especially with a new product. It's very difficult. And of course, you have competitors, and they're trying to find that, and you wind up with this kind of process where you settle on an equilibrium point. But I'd say there's a great test, immediate test, namely if you find out there's a big unsold surplus, you know the price is too high. If you find out there's a shortage, in other words, the thing disappears quickly, then then it's obviously a signal you can raise the price without any problem. So that's the immediate feedback you get. You see, whether the stuff is not being sold. This is true not just for consumer goods, but for also producers' goods. Down the line, if you're producing raw material or something, if you find out it's not being sold, you have to lower the price. Yeah.
Is it possible that a company could have a higher total revenue even if they do have surplus, and rather be equally point?
Well, we're dealing with a. Why would that?
Like we said before, the demand curve is elastic enough. They might have a high total revenue even though they might have surplus.
Well, but there's no point then. See, they're losing money by having produced the surplus and sticking to it. In other words, if they've already produced this thing, whatever it is, they'll benefit by any sale of it. I mean, maybe in the future they'll say, well, gee, we're not going to produce, we can produce less. We'll tap a higher revenue. But once you've produced it, then you're stuck. I mean, you've already spent the money on this thing. You try to sell it for as much as you can. Nobody's going to benefit by piling up unsold Wonder Bread or unsold TV sets. You know, what you're talking about is a future decision of how much you produce in the future. Okay, right now we're talking about a day-to-day situation. Once given the amount produced, what happens? How does the price set? We'll get to that later on. How you decide what's going to be, how much to produce for next year or next time period. Okay, so we have this built-in mechanism for arriving at the free market price, and it will be the intersection point. And then the question is, well, if this is true, I think it is, why do prices ever change? Why isn't every price the same forever? Now, obviously, the reason why prices don't change is for one of two reasons, or both. Namely, either the demand curve changes or the supply changes. The only way in which any price can change over time is a change in one of these two underlying factors, or both. Of course, in order to analyze both, you have to analyze each one, obviously, and you just combine them. Okay, let's look then at what happens with supply changes. Easier. For example, let's say usually about every 5 years there's a big frost in Brazil, which is our major coffee producer. And big frost, and it kills half the coffee plants. All right, so there's a big drop in the supply of coffee. In other words, how much coffee comes on the market, say, next month or whatever. So the supply curve shifts to the left. I'm making this dash in order to show the change here. So you have a drop in a lowering of the supply of this product. What happens? It means that the old price, the old equilibrium price, let's say coffee used to be $1 a pound back in the good old days, not too long ago. It means that the old price, as much of supply is suddenly lowered. So it means that with a new supply, you now have a shortage. In other words, demand, which used to be that demand and supply were cleared at $1 a pound. All of a sudden, you find since the supply has been lowered, that all of a sudden you find there's a shortage has opened up. There's a shortage. There's now a situation where people can't find the product at $1 a pound, so the price goes up. And the price is bid up by the buyers until finally it reaches whatever, say $1.50 a pound. At the new equilibrium price, we again clear the market. In other words, demand again, this becomes excess demand, and demand and supply are now cleared at the higher price. So a higher price clears the market. Now this demonstrates the two functions the price system performs in the market. Two functions. Most people understand one function, they don't understand the other. One is the incentive function. We'll get to that later on. In other words, if the price is higher, people will produce more, over the longer run. If you offer, well, just to give you an idea, they used to be 1948, I think it was 48, when there was only one atomic energy consumer, namely the U.S. government. And I think it was called the Atomic Energy Commission. They're trying to find uranium. There's a, quote, uranium shortage. Couldn't find the uranium. They were going crazy. We can't get uranium is gone. We can't produce any more atom bombs. The world is going to come to an end or whatever. Aside from whether or not they should be producing more atom bombs, it's another philosophic question. Some economists down there finally said, look, turkeys, double the price you're offering. I mean, there's only one buyer, the U.S. government. They're offering whatever it was per ton of uranium. Double the price and see what happens. They double the price, and all of a sudden everybody's out there with their Geiger counters, the famous uranium boom. Out in the West, the Geiger counter, by God, there was no uranium shortage. They found lots of uranium. And all they have to do is to double the price offer, and uranium flowed in like nobody's business. The stuff is out there, whatever the stuff is. You have to offer a higher price to induce them to go out and look for it. Most people sort of understand this. Not everybody understands it. If you offer a higher price for something, you'll probably get more, greater supply, and vice versa. The thing they don't understand at all is what you can call the rationing function. In other words, the reason why everything has a price at all is because it's not unlimited. Remember the universal fact of scarcity. Everything is scarce. Some things are scarcer than others. If something were unlimited, it'd be free, like air. presumably. Okay, water used to be before water shortages, so they're quote free unquote, almost close to it. But coffee is not free. Coffee is scarce, like everything else, and the things which produce coffee are scarce. And if they get scarcer, that means the pricing performs a rationing function. Pricing of anything performs the function of squeezing out the submarginal buyers, people who don't want to spend $1 a pound. They only drink coffee if it's 20 cents a pound. If it's not $1 a pound, they'll drink something else, water or cocoa, whatever it is. So the point is that prices perform a rationing function. If the thing becomes scarcer, prices have to ration even more. And so, by the price going up, it performs the function of squeezing out marginal buyers. In other words, those who are close to the edge of buying coffee. What happened a few years ago, this happened and the price of coffee doubled almost overnight because there's a big drop in supply, big increase in price, and people started buying, they bought less coffee almost permanently. In other words, they cut the amount of coffee they drank. Some people shifted permanently to tea, others to cocoa. We'll get into that later too. And the result of all this was they voluntarily restricted their purchases. Some people bought the same amount of coffee. Some people were coffee freaks. They said, oh, well, I'll spend more money on it. Others, however, are only marginal coffee buyers, and they cut their consumption. So the result of all that is a voluntary rationing process. The alternative to voluntary rationing is government rationing, which we'll get to later too. When the government issues tickets. First of all, they hire hundreds of thousands of people to issue ticket books and enforce all this stuff, ration books. Which they did during World War II, and everybody's you have only 10 coupons a week to buy coffee, 10 pounds a week or something, and then there's a whole hassle. And in addition to paying for the coffee and money, you also have to pay the ration tickets. It's a total mess. At any rate, but there it's compulsory. It means if you buy more than 10, whatever it is, 5 pounds a week, whatever it is, and you're illegal, state of illegality, you can go to jail. What the price system does is do this voluntarily in accordance with each person's value scale, in accordance with how much they value coffee, vis-a-vis everything else. Okay, so the price goes up as the supply falls. In other words, look at it this way. A drop in supply of X leads to an increase in the price of X. Okay, the opposite happens. I'm saying in economics, almost all laws are symmetrical. Look at the other side of a coin. Okay, here we have coffee is flowing back in. You have a big increase in coffee production. The climate's better, whatever it is. Right? There's an increased fertilizer, different techniques. So the supply of coffee goes up. This means that at the old price, where demand and supply are equal, all of a sudden you have a bigger supply now. You have instead of X amount of coffee, you have more than that. This means that at the greater supply, you have at the old price, you now have an excess surplus. You have unsold surplus of supply here. Because supply is increased, it's still up at this price. It means in order to induce people to buy more than whatever it is, 100,000 pounds of coffee, whatever it happens to be, in order to induce people to buy more, you have to cut the price. And as you cut the price, they're now willing to buy the increased supply. And so the price falls to get back to a new equilibrium point where supply and demand are again equal. So this, in other words, you eliminate the excess supply and you wind up with supply and demand being equal. So we conclude that an increase in the supply of X will lead to a drop in the price. And this is what happens. Of course, the coffee thing is a beautiful example because this happens all the time. The coffee, there's a frost in the coffee in Brazil. There's a drop in supply, there's an increase in price, and a couple of years later the frost is gone, supply increases, and the price drops again. So this is almost a textbook case, but it happens all the time. All sorts of products. Agriculture is a good example because agriculture you have actual full supply. You don't have that much in other things. In most things, supply increases over time. With agriculture, of course, it's more in the lap of the gods than other products. But in general, supply increases. In general, you have an increase in supply of almost everything. In that case, if that's true, which it is, you should have generally falling prices. Okay? In other words, over time, supply increases, price falls. By the way, this is not to lead to lower profits, because costs fall also, as we'll see later on. In other words, there's a general increase in productivity and costs fall, and so there's no particular, doesn't mean you're squeezing firms or anything like that. So you've got then a situation where most prices should be falling, and yet, of course, as we all know, prices are almost always going up. Even now, when it's supposed to be the end of inflation, this is a macro. We discussed this in macro. This is really a macro concept. But even now, when inflation is supposed to be over, it's still going up. Prices are still going up about 3 or 4% a year. This is when inflation is supposed to be over. It's over only in the sense that 5-6 years ago, prices were going up by 14% a year. So if it's true that supply usually goes up, how come prices are going up? And that's a good question. The answer is, there's nothing to do with this good stuff. Goods are going up, increasing. The answer is with money, and the fact that the demand curve is always going up because of money, the government's printing money and pouring it into the system. So that's, let's say, a macro problem. If we're just up to micro, prices would always be falling. And in fact, in general, from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, in other words, from about 1780, let's say, or 1800, until 1940, prices fell all the time. Every year prices would fall a bit, except during wartime. During the War of 1812, the Civil War, the World War I and World War II, the government printed a lot of money in order to pay for the war effort. Of course, prices went up. All the other times, in other words, during peacetime, prices generally fell. The difference now is because the different money systems come in since the 1930s. A totally inflationary monetary system is now taken over of the government's printing factory, money printing press, counterfeiting printing press factories down in Washington. For example, I mean, all of you are probably alive to this, namely computers. Of course, computers started off extremely expensive and now very cheap. They keep getting cheaper for a while. They're getting cheaper almost every week. Calculators, which I remember the first time I saw a hand calculator. It wasn't too long ago, maybe 10 years ago or something. And I think it was about 10, 12 years ago, right? And it was on in the elevator here, and one of my friends in the EE department, and he said, look, we have this magic thing, new product, and all we have to do is to punch these buttons, and it multiplies and all that. I said, Jesus, that's fantastic. He said, yeah, it's only $500. I got it at a discount. Right? So the capitalist system is so fantastic that right now we have a lot better calculators for $18. So this is what happens when the economy is given its head, so to speak, with very little interference, and you have a fantastic increase of productivity, increase in quality, and a huge drop in price. Same thing happened with TV sets. The first TV sets around 1948, 1950, they were murky. Not only were they black and white, we can hardly see anything. I mean, it's very murky images. Of course, there's no cable either. I mean, and it cost about $2,000. The whole neighborhood sitting around gazing at these little flickering images, right? So now you have, even with inflation, even the fact that the dollar is worth 1/5, let's say, what it was in 1948, even so, the prices are fantastically smaller and much better, much higher quality. You have to take price per unit quality, too, you see. And so you get a fantastic, like 98% drop in prices. If you take the unit quality and you can realize, discount for inflation. It's unbelievable. So this is what can be done in a free market system. Even with, as I say, the government printing press, which makes prices in general higher. Okay, this is, So in other words, with the supply changes, you don't have supply increases. You'll have supply drops. You have an increase in price, and supply increases. You have a fall in price. And now, one thing I'm going to stress here, which every micro teacher always stresses this, and always makes the point, and always says that half the students at least will get this wrong on a test, and they're always right, even though it seems to be a simple point. It seems to be something which can be very, very difficult to get through the heads of students. Namely, the difference between when you increase supply, for example, you're going down the existing demand curve. The demand curve is defined as the locus of responses to price. In other words, given X, the price of so-and-so, how much will be purchased? That's what the demand curve is. So therefore, the one thing which can't change the demand curve is a change in price. The one thing which can't change the demand curve, by definition, is a change in price. Because the demand curve is constructed as responses to price. So if you have an increase in supply, it does not increase the demand curve. It increases the quantity demanded going down the existing demand curve. Okay? This is the curve itself. As the supply drops, you're going up the existing demand curve. You're not, the demand curve as a whole doesn't shift. You're going up, you're decreasing the quantity demanded because you're going up the same demand curve. We haven't gotten to the shifts in the demand curve yet. That's the next step. I just want to point out the change in price will only go up or down the existing given demand curve by definition. Okay. That's a change in supply. The other thing which can change is the demand curve. In other words, the demand curve can shift. So why would the demand curve shift? Well, it doesn't shift because of response to price, as I said. There's one thing you can't shift in response to, that's how it's defined. It can shift because of inflation. In other words, if the government prints more money and gives it or spends it so everybody gets more money, they'll have more money to buy on everything. So it means the demand curve as a whole will shift. Every demand curve will shift upward. In other words, at any given price, everybody will spend more money or buy more goods try to buy more goods for every given price. In other words, the demand curve as a whole shifts upward and to the right. So this is an upward shift. In other words, everybody's willing to spend more for any given price because everybody's got more money. Let's say the government prints twice as much money and gives it to everybody. One of my favorite examples I call the Angel Gabriel model. This is David Hume, a similar model. He didn't call it the Angel Gabriel model. But anyway, essentially he said, what happens if an angel comes at night and doubles everybody's supply of money? Just by magic. And everybody's got twice as much money. They go and, of course, they spend it. Everybody's now willing to spend a lot more on everything. So the demand curve shifts upward and to the right. Of course, prices will then double more or less on the end of it. But that was Hume's point. But we don't get into that part of it here. It's again a macro point. But again, the situation is that the demand curve as a whole, if everybody's got more money in their pocket, the demand curve will go up. On the other hand, if people have less money in their pocket, the demand curve will shift downward. In other words, downward and to the left. They will spend less money in any given item. I think that D prime, I think that D double prime. This will also happen, for example, if taxes go up. If the big income tax increase, just looking at the taxpayers, they'll have less money in their pocket. All the demand curves will shift to the downward and to the left. They won't have the money to spend. Very simple. If there's a big tax cut, the demand curve will shift upward. Again, we're not going to go too much into that because that's a macro point. But I want to point out that demand curves, part of the thing which influences demand curves is how much money people have in their pockets. Okay, for individual goods and services, demand curves will shift on the basis of value scale changes. So that and these value scales change all the time on the basis of fashion, preferences, whatever. For example, in the United States in the last 40 years, there's been a big shift of values, of preferences by consumers on the wine front, on the wine and whiskey front, I should say. A big shift out of so-called heavy liquors, okay, and into so-called light stuff, either because people want to lose weight or whatever it is. Okay? In other words, there's been a big shift away from bourbon and scotch and especially rye whiskey. As a matter of fact, when I was growing up, everybody was drinking blended whiskey. Almost nobody drinks blended whiskey anymore. Blended. So these things are going way down. The demand curves have shifted way down for those. On the other hand, vodka and gin have gone way up. On the wine front, there's been a big shift away from red wine and a big shift in favor of white wine. Enormous. So you have so-called yuppies, for example, are known as the white wine and quiche set. So white wine, as a matter of fact, there's been a shift away from alcohol and toward white wine altogether. There's a huge increase in white. And 40 years ago, nobody drank white wine because it was almost unheard of. So at any rate, these things reflect, this means, of course, the demand curve front, what you have is means to say bourbon, demand curve for bourbon goes down, okay? Means people are now, means that the old prices will fall, that the old prices, there's now a surplus, unsold surplus, supply greater than demand. The price will have to fall to meet it. On the other hand, say with vodka or white wine, there's a big increase in demand curve. The whole demand curve shifts upward, and it means the old price is now a shortage, so price will go up. So in other words, an increase in the demand curve for X, in other words, the whole curve shifts upward. That's what an increase. And when we just use the phrase or the word increase in demand, it means the entire demand curve. It does not mean this thing here when supply goes up, say, and your quantity demanded increases. If you just use the phrase increase in demand, it refers to the entire curve. It means that any given price, people will buy more of it than they did before. That's what it means. Okay? So it means the entire demand curve goes up, say here to here, and so an increase in demand for X will yield an increase in price of X. On the other hand, a drop in the demand for X, say for bourbon, will yield a drop in the price. Because people will not buy the same amount, but buy less at any given price. They will not buy at the old price, but buy less than they did before. There's an unsold surplus. The result of this, the impact of these demand changes, will result in changes in supply. And now we get to what causes producers to produce the thing in the first place. So far we've been talking about supply being given. Supply is 100,000 loaves or whatever, and that's it. Now we begin to talk about what determines supply. Why do producers produce 100,000 to begin with? How do they determine how much to produce? And the next step we'll get to is how these demand changes impact on that. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break and we'll go back. Let's turn to the step, namely, why are decisions made to produce as much as are being produced? Why do they decide to produce 100,000 loaves of Wonder Bread and not 50,000, not 200,000? Okay, let's see what happens here. Quiet, please. Price, quantity, supply, demand. Let's take a situation where demand changes, demand increases for vodka or whatever, white wine, whatever it happens to be. So there's a permanent, well, first of all, businessmen have to decide, is this a glitch in the system or is it permanent? And that's something that has to be done by insight into again, the price goes up because of the increase in demand. The new equilibrium price is now higher. And it has to be decided. For example, the guys who lucked down into Cabbage Patch dolls. People have been producing dolls for 80 years, right? And nothing much happened one way or the other. All of a sudden, the Cabbage Patch doll hits. Unbelievable, tremendous demand for it. I remember one guy, the great thing is one guy from Pennsylvania actually flew to London to get it because there was a big shortage. And the question is, for the Cabbage Patch doll, people had to decide in the following years, is this a temporary thing, a blinding blaze which will be going next year or not? Well, it still continued at a certain, it fell off a little bit. So they have to decide, is this a sort of a permanent thing? Okay, with white wine, they figure, vodka, yes it is. And so what then happens is, if they figure, well, this is going to be a permanent increase in demand, tastes are changing, basically, et cetera, then they will gear up and produce more vodka for the future. In other words, they start changing the situation, getting white grapes instead of red grapes for the white wine, and they gear up, and how long this takes depends on the technological situation. Depends on how long it takes to produce more vodka or more white wine or more calculators or whatever. And so the length of time depends on the technology of the product. But at any rate, it means that over time, because the increase in price means more profits, it means that there's a greater price per product being sold than before. They gear up and they produce more of it. So over the years, supply curve will then shift. In other words, the next year's supply line will be higher, will be to the right, shifting to the right, et cetera. You wind up, let's say, after about a few years, with a permanently new supply curve, which is now which reflects the increased demand for vodka. In other words, so this means you have a time situation, a time period situation where in year one, let's say, the price goes up. And the first thing that happens, the demand curve for X goes up. This increases the price. A year later, the supply goes up a little bit in response to that, and so you have the price going down a little bit. Increase the supply of X, a drop in the price, and so forth and so on, until you get, say, to here, where the price is down somewhere in between the initial one here and up there. And so as the supply goes up, the price of it then falls over time. So what you have is a series of vertical increases in supply going like that until finally you get a new final equilibrium point. In other words, this is a long-run equilibrium point. It takes 4 years or 5 years, depending on how long it takes to gear up for all this. So what you have is you wind up eventually with a permanent increase in supply and reflecting this permanent increase in demand for, say, white wine or vodka. On the other hand, let's take the falling demand. Bourbon, let's say, bourbon, there was a fall in demand for bourbon, demand curve for bourbon, and so you have a D prime, the new curve goes like that. At first you have a big drop as you have the surplus from the previous price is now unsold surplus, and you wind up with a lower price, and a new equilibrium price is much lower. Then if the winemakers, the whiskey makers, believe this is going to be permanent, this reflects a permanent change, a drop in demand for red wine or bourbon, then over the years they will supply less of it. They'll shift away from red wine into white wine, which of course is exactly what they've done. Much less red wine is being produced now than there used to be. Much more white wine. Doesn't mean all red wine disappears. There's always a margin. It's a question of marginal changes. Less bourbon, more vodka. And so what you have is a lower supply each year, and as the supply drops, you have price goes up again until you wind up somewhere in the middle. And so you have then over time, in response to the lower demand for red wine, you have a much lower supply, have a lower price and a lower supply relative to white wine. You wind up then with a permanently lower supply as a response to the lower demand. Okay? So in other words, over time, production of when entrepreneurs produce something, they're doing it in anticipation of selling it to the consumer, anticipated demand. If the demand rises, it means they realize, they expect it, and they will produce more to meet that demand. If the demand falls, they realize and expect it, means they'll produce less in response to that. It means over time, the consumers decide how much will be purchased, how much will be produced of everything. If they like a product and they go for it in a big way, calculators, computers, or whatever, a lot more will be produced. There's a huge shift of resources, land, labor, and capital, into this new industry. If, on the other hand, they don't like a product, they go away from it, resources will flow out of the industry, out of red wine into white wine, out of bourbon into vodka and whatever. Of course, you have, for example, calculator. Before the calculator, I don't know if any of you have seen this, unless there's a technological museum somewhere. When I was going to college and taking statistics, they have what's called, I think, multiplying machines is the name for it, I believe. And they were big bruisers, huge, very heavy, and they have a whole bunch of keyboard, you keep punching it to get to multiply something and divide, and it took a long time. It took only slightly less time than doing it by pencil. And they had a statistical labs which would take you hours to use these bruisers, and they of course, they're obsolete. They were totally obsolesced by calculators and computers, and so they should have. And some of these companies, I think, are no longer here. They're no longer producing that stuff. Burroughs, Frieden, those are the big names and these calculating machines, I guess they were called. And so less of them is produced. If any, right now, I guess zero is produced of that stuff, and they shift to other better products, which are demanded by consumers. In some cases, like the horse and buggy, there used to be millions of carriages being produced every year. There ain't no carriages except for the hansom cabs in Central Park. There's still a few. There's obviously some little hansom cab plant somewhere. They produce maybe one a year, something like that. But the hansom cab industry has fallen by the wayside, and so they should have. The automobiles come in to replace it. So So over the long run, and the long run is that long, consumers decide by their demand curves, by the value scales and demand curves, how much should be produced, where resources should go into, where land, labor, capital, science, whatever, engineers, where they should focus their attention on. And it's decided by the price system, through the price system, through demand curves, and profit and loss system, who's going to make profits where, and this reflects the intensity of demand by consumers. That's how the system works. That's how resources get funneled out of bourbon and into vodka, out of red wine into white wine, and so forth, out of calculating machines and into calculators, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so this is the demand curves. Prices can change either by change in supply or a change in demand. If the supply increases, price will fall. If the supply decreases, the price rises. If the demand curve increases, price rises and will, if considered permanent, induce a greater increase, a long-run increase in supply. And if the demand curve falls and considered permanent, it will induce a long-run drop in supply. Now, if you take this, any given product, and take this vertical curve, and if you look at if the demand curve increases, and what will happen to supply as a result? And you wind up, let's say, here. If the demand curve falls, what happens to supply as a result? It will keep dropping until here. And if you connect these dots, you get what the textbook has as a forward-sloping supply curve. So that's where that comes from. What this is a long-run supply curve. It reflects what happens if the price settles at any given point for a long period. This is how much will be produced. If the price settles at $1.50 a loaf for Wonder Bread, to produce more of it. If the price settles for 75 cents a loaf, to produce less of it. Over the long run, the long-run supply curve then is not the same thing as the demand curve. It doesn't belong on the same graph. That's one of the basic problems with it. The demand curve is instantaneous. It's a freeze-frame situation. Any given day, this is what the demand curve is. This is how much will be purchased at any given price. The vertical supply line is the equivalent. That belongs on the same graph. That's the freeze frame. That's essentially today's supply. How much is available at the store to be sold today? The long-run upward-sloping supply curve is a third-dimension thing. It incorporates time in it. It's a long-run situation which tells you how much will be produced. In other words, if over time, if a lot more will be produced at a higher price, it'll be like that. If there'll only be a small increase in production at a higher price, it'll be something like that. It doesn't belong on the same graph. It's interesting, but it's not really, it's not relevant to immediate price determination. That's the problem with it. Also, the elasticity of supply doesn't make that much difference, but there's some interest. Most supply is elastic. I mean, if you offer a higher price, you'll get more, as I said with uranium. But it hasn't got the same importance as the elasticity of demand because total revenue doesn't depend on it. If you sell more, you get at a higher price, you get a higher total revenue. You never have a lower total revenue at a higher price with a supply curve. Okay? So it doesn't really have the same importance. So that's why when dealing with day-to-day demand, immediate real demand curves and supply curves, I deal with a vertical. Whereas the forward-sloping one is the long run, looking over time for different products. One thing is, which you can deal with right now, is there ain't almost no such thing as a vertical supply curve. Of course, it's true in the long run. Rembrandts, there's not going to be any more Rembrandts being produced because Rembrandt's dead. It's very simple. So the supply of Rembrandts is not only vertical right now, it's fixed forever. Except they might lose a Rembrandt and it'll go down. There's no way in which the supply of Rembrandt's going to increase, except if somebody forges a perfect forgery. It's very difficult because the technology of detecting forgery for art is enormous. You have X-ray equipment, all sorts of other stuff, pigments, and the whole science of art detection. And there are very good forgers in the sense they paint as well as Rembrandt does. They can forge it, but they can't really get away with it technologically. So other things, on the other hand, are they're usually much more. You can increase the supply if you want to do it. And There's plenty of stuff, and we'll get to this later on when we get to energy. Since 1890, there have been so-called experts in the field of oil who claim that in 10 years oil will run out. Ain't going to be no more oil left. They've been saying this since 1890. In other words, the experts in 1890 said, by 1900, there's going to be no more oil. Why do they say that? Because it's very simple. I mean, you can use mathematical models, but basically it's very simple. What they do is this. They take proven reserves underground. Okay, so proven reserves, I don't know, I haven't got the figure. Let's say the proven reserves are 1 billion barrels, all right? And then they say, well, you look at the annual use of oil, annual consumption of oil. They say, well, it's 100 million barrels a year, annual consumption. So they conclude okay, it's very simple. They conclude in 10 years the oil's running out. It's a very simple extrapolation. The problem with it, and the same people more or less have been saying this, as I say, since 1890. The problem with it is that proven reserves don't mean a damn thing. Proven reserves are only what they've already mapped. They know exactly where the stuff is. There's plenty of stuff down there which you haven't mapped yet. And so when the price goes up, well, let's say, for example, let's say here's oil. Let's say we'll get to energy in detail later on. But let's say the supply starts going down for oil. As the supply goes down, we know now what happens. Price goes up. As the price goes up, you have two effects now, the incentive effect and the rationing effect. The rationing effect means that people will buy less oil. The marginal oil buyers are going to disappear. This, of course, is exactly what happened in the late 70s. The price goes up, they start conserving, quote unquote. In other words, they just buy less of it. They find ways to do it. Usually they say, gee, we can't buy less oil. Oil is essential in the modern economy and all that stuff. This says nothing marginally. In other words, you can always buy less of something. Just like with the subways. You can always have one less subway ride a week. And this adds up if you have 1 million people do it. So, the price goes up. You're going down the same demand curve, up the demand curve. In other words, with lower quantity demanded. And with the price going up, there's more incentive to go out there and look for oil. The price of oil is higher. We're going to go and start looking for it. And they go looking for it, and by God, they find it. There's lots of oil down there. It's just a question of it costs money to go and explore it, pour for it, drill it, and all that sort of stuff. And as the price goes up, there's more of an incentive to drill for oil, and by God, they find it. And so what's been happening since 1890 is proven reserves keep going up, even with the annual consumption. Even with the annual consumption, there's enough proven reserves magically keep increasing. And the reason why technologists tend to overlook this, and they did that, the famous flopperoo on this was the Global 2000 report, that I think was submitted to President Carter in the mid-70s, who claimed that by 1980 or 1985, oil would disappear, plus everything else. They used computer models and big shot technology. The problem was there wasn't one economist in the lot. And they forgot about the price system. What marks everybody who's not an economist is they forget about the price system. They assume the prices are not important. And so that they assume that demand has nothing to do with prices and supply has nothing to do with prices. In other words, they assume that everything is vertical. Okay? And so what happens in real life is, as I say, when the price of oil goes up, people start buying less of it, and also they start looking for more of it. And so the supply keeps increasing. And this is exactly what happened, and refutes all these gloom and doom forecasters are constantly being refuted for that reason. We'll see later on, this is exactly what happened to OPEC. OPEC finally cut its throat. It took some years to do it, but they finally got to the point where non-OPEC countries were finding and producing more oil, like Britain and so forth and so on. At any rate, there's so this is now you're armed, you see. You're a technologist who are now armed with economic knowledge, which most technologists don't have. I'll give you already a leg up. And the next guy says oil is going to disappear in 10 years. Remember, you've heard that they've been saying this for 100 years now. There's also, by the way, I'm not taking a position on this because I know this is not my area. I just want to point out to you that there's apparently a maverick big shot astrophysicist who's also big in geology and everything else at Cornell, who claims that oil is not produced from fossil fuels. It does not come from vegetable and animal sediments. but the hydrocarbons really come from other stuff, non-organic matter. So if he's proven right, this means there's a lot of oil, particularly natural gas, way down deep. And so long probes will find a lot of stuff down there. If they do, and all the stuff gets shot to hell. Then there's almost no shortage ever of especially natural gas. Anyway, Sweden is now having a deep probe, which will apparently test this theory. So it should come up in a year or two. Find out whether this is true or not. Apparently, but his basis of this thing, one of the things he says is the meteorites have a lot of hydrocarbons, which obviously does not come from animal or vegetable sediment. So, anyway, I don't want to get involved in a debate on that. I'm just pointing that out. Okay, so we now see how prices are determined by supply and demand, and how in the long run they're determined by supply and demand. How increases in demand will pull resources into areas. Decreases in demand will take resources away from those areas. And so that consumer demand is sort of the king and queen of the economic system. Consumers determine what will be profitable and therefore what will be produced, and what will make it on the market and what won't. The famous example, not so much economists, some writers intellectuals claim that demand is determined by advertising. All you have to do is advertise something and people will buy it. Well, advertisers wish that were true. It would make their life a lot easier. Not only doesn't it always work, you need advertising in order to sell something, especially a new product, but advertising was no panacea. There's, of course, the famous example of the Etzel, flopperoo of the Etzel car, which had lots of advertising, lots of clout behind them. It was a total flopperoo. And it's right now the Etzels are fairly heavily in demand as a collector's item, by the way. That's and you get to the point where it's a collector's item. Another famous flopperoo was originally when shoes there's a big thing where shoes were made out of Corfan instead of leather. I think Corfan has made a comeback in a sort of a mixed system. But anyway, the idea was Corfan shoes were sold on the basis that the shoe never wears out, which is undoubtedly true, except the problem was the feet wore out. So nobody wanted to wear this damn thing. It was, again, a total flopperoo. Something that's slightly forgotten by the technologists who were crazy about Corfan. At any rate, so these things, and by the way, one of the examples of how the demand is not determined by advertising is the existence of a huge market research subculture in the United States. A whole bunch of market researchers. It's also a good part-time occupation, by the way, for people who want to spend a few hours a week at this thing. And what they do is the businessmen are desperately trying to find out, will consumers buy this product? Will they buy this ad? Will they go for it? And obviously an indication that they can't determine anything. They're just trying to find out. My God, well, which will they like better? Which will they dislike more? So they're constantly trying to find out desperately, courting the consumer, trying to figure out what the consumer will like or won't like. It's hardly a determined process. And one thing and sometimes, of course, intellectuals gripe about the stridency of advertising. But you have to realize it's a great world, it's a great system where consumers are courted, even stridently. Desperately try my product. You have to get the consumer's attention first. Consumers bombarded by all sorts of stuff. People are busy, they got lots of things to think about or whatever. And so why should they worry about some product? Well, you have to sort of catch the attention of a person. Hey, here's my product. Fantastic. In socialist countries, they don't worry about consumers. Consumers are a pain in the neck. There's not much advertising as a result. There's no courting the consumer. The consumers are as I say, are a burden. It's a much worse system to be a burden. A consumer to be a burden than to be courted. I'll tell you that. In socialist countries, in countries where government is in the saddle instead of consumers, then it's considered. Anytime anybody uses something or consumes something, you're wasting the social product, quote unquote. In other words, you're a consumer. You're wasting this. The government, the bureaucrats own the thing, and they're reluctant to have anybody use it because sometimes you're making it shorter. That's the thinking that goes behind it. You can see here. We'll get to the water shortage, the alleged water shortage later on. But you can see here when the water shortage hit, the whole attitude on the part of here's the government, which essentially municipalized the water industry. And water industry used to be private way back. Now you have all government water companies, water services. The whole attitude on the part of these guys is the consumers are a pain in the neck. They're using water. Stop using it. That's their attitude. Great attitude. Stop using everything. You'll never have any shortage. Nobody eats, drinks, or does anything else. So they immediately start blaming the consumer. There's a water shortage because consumers are drinking too much, they're showering too much, whatever. They're washing their cars. And a private enterprise and a private firm, they don't blame consumers. They're trying to get their custom. They're trying to get people to use the product. They don't consider it a pain in the neck. They consider it great. They're trying to find ways to get people to increase the consumption of the product. They don't blame them. As a matter of fact, if you have a private water company, they try desperately to get more water. They try to get the water, enough water, try to get the reservoirs and the pipes and all pipelines and all sorts of stuff in such a way that people have plenty of water to use. It's only when government supplies it that the whole thing is a pain in the neck, because government doesn't live by profit. They don't care about profits. They don't go bankrupt if they have deficits. They just tax the people more to make up the money. Uncle Sap, in other words, the taxpayer, pays the difference. So it's a totally different attitude, plus the different economics. Totally different attitude of the government officials in this thing. There's no incentive for them to supply water, a lot of it, or efficiently, or anything else. The whole thing becomes something to get on the payroll, get your guys, your organization people on the payroll, and also to get the taxpayers to keep funneling money into it. So you never have a private firm saying, well, stop using it's your fault. You're drinking too much water, you're showering too much. That's not the attitude. That is the attitude, of course, as I say, with government. When we get to the water shortage later on, we'll see how the pricing system had a big effect on that. But as a general attitude, you can see right away the difference between courting the consumer, trying to get people to buy more of your stuff, and considering consumption or use just sort of a pain in the neck, a necessary evil at best. Okay. Okay, we now have each individual price of each individual good, how each individual price is determined by the intersection of falling demand curve and a vertical supply line for any given time period, and how it changes over time, either by changing the supply curve or changing the demand curve, which then becomes a resource pulling effect. In other words, which then increases or decreases resources going into the particular product. What we now have to look at is relationship between different goods. In other words, what we've been doing so far is talking about each good at a time. And now we have to start talking about what the relationships are between different products. Okay, some goods are close substitutes. Every good, in a sense, is a substitute for the consumer dollar. In other words, you can spend more. You spend more of something. Your money you have is fixed. If you spend more on good X, you'll by necessarily be spending less on good Y. That's a general situation. But more than that, you have some goods which are close substitutes, or substitutes. And some goods which are not. And close substitutes have a different relationship between their demand and supply curves. For example, let's get to the coffee case. Okay. Coffee. And coffee supply falls because of a big frost, and price goes up. There are substitutes for coffee, which are then become intimately related to this thing. In other words, when people started buying less coffee because of the increased price, they shifted to other things like cocoa and tea. They had, in other words, this is tea, which is a close substitute of coffee. The demand curve for tea went up in response. In other words, people were willing to buy tea, increased purchases at any given price because the demand curve went up in response to the higher price for coffee. In other words, the chain of cause and effect works like this. An increase, fall in supply of X, in other words, coffee, raises the price of X. But since X and Y are close substitutes, an increase in the price of X brings about an increase in the demand for Y. Because X is now more expensive, coffee is more expensive. A lot of people say, well, the heck with coffee, I'm shifting to tea. You're only a marginal coffee drinker, you're going to shift to tea. As you shift to tea, like that, the price of tea begins to go up. How much it goes up, we don't know, because it all depends on the tea market, the coffee market, or whatever. But the point is, there's now an increase in the demand curve for tea, which leads the price of tea to go up also eventually, or to some extent. So we now have demand for Y increases the price of Y. In other words, in response to the more expensive coffee, demand for tea goes up and the price of tea becomes also more expensive. Well, how much it does, we don't know. It's not a quantitative law, it's a qualitative law. So we have a situation, in other words, where two things are competitive. There's a drive here toward, when the supply changes, there's a drive toward making the price of the other one also competitive by this kind of process. It becomes more expensive. People then turn to tea because it's cheaper, relatively cheaper than coffee now. And tea becomes more expensive eventually too. So competition then cuts not only within each product, also between close substitutes. And the same way for cocoa. The same process occurred for cocoa. We have this cocoa. We have demand for cocoa going up. Demand for Z increases. Increased price of Z. Okay, let's look at the other way around now. Increased supply of coffee. Coffee is now, frost is over. Price goes down. And so the fact is that coffee is now cheaper. The demand curve for tea drops. So the whole demand curve for tea falls because coffee is cheaper. People are willing to buy less tea at any given price. And so the price of tea then drops in response to that. In other words, you just reverse the signs here. An increase in the supply of X will lead to a fall in the price of X, and which in turn will lead to a drop in the demand for Y, the substitute, and this will lead to a drop in the price of Y. Similarly for Z. Demand curve for cocoa falls, the price of cocoa falls along with it. So that's the close substitute. This happens all throughout the market, of course, not just for coffee and tea, but for everything. Substitutes for raw material, substitutes for machinery, metals, all sorts of things. Iron and aluminum, whatever, aluminum and magnesium, all these things are substitutes in some way, one way or the other. They're not perfect substitutes, but they're close substitutes, and they affect each other's market, they impact on each other's market. Let's see what happens when there's a... Okay, that's what happens when there's a change in supply. A change in supply will cause a change in the price, and a similar change in prices for the other substitutes. On the other hand, something different happens when there's a change in demand, because the change in demand usually reflects a change in the value scale between, say, coffee and tea anyway. In other words, say this is the coffee market, and this is the tea market. And let's say people begin to shift from tea to coffee. As a matter of fact, originally in the United States we drank mostly tea. Coffee was sort of a late addition. And so there's a big shift from tea to coffee. That means the demand curve for coffee goes up. And eventually, of course, supply increases in response to it. Demand curve for tea goes down, and the price falls. And eventually the supply will fall in response. But when you have this kind of a shift, in other words, when you have a shift reflecting changes in the value scales of the consumer, then there's an opposite change in price. In other words, the coffee price goes up, at least in the short run, to reflect the the increased demand for coffee, and the price of tea goes down to reflect the fall in demand for tea. So in this case, in the case where the value scale shift, the prices move in opposite directions instead of the same direction, because now you're having a difference in values on the part of the consumer. They don't want tea anymore. They shift away from it. The price of tea drops in response to that. They want more coffee, and the price of coffee goes up in response to that. So you're moving in the opposite directions in response to opposite changes in values. When there was a supply change, then it was the same change in the same direction, because the values remain the same. The value scales remain the same. It's just the different supply conditions. Now you have a change in value, a shift in value scales. The value scales are all relative to each other. If one thing goes up, the other thing has to go down, because it's all ranking, if you remember. So in white wine, red wine, there's been an increase in the expense of white wine compared to red wine. Of course, then there's a shift in supply, and the price drops, etc., in response to that. So then the changes in price are opposite to each other. So that's what happens with close substitutes. Okay, you've got a big dose here tonight today. That's all I think I'll leave at this point. Dose here tonight today. That's all I think I'll leave at this point. Dose here tonight today. That's all I think I'll leave at this point. Dose here tonight today. That's all I think I'll leave at this point. Dose here tonight today. That's all I think I'll leave at this point. Dose here tonight today. That's all I think I'll leave at this point. Dose here tonight today. That's all I think I'll leave at this point. Dose here tonight today. That's all I think I'll